I've never been the type to get excited about Black Friday. I've always hated crowds, and the idea of fighting over deals while being shoved around didn't exactly match my idea of fun. But that year, my sister insisted I take advantage of the sales to buy something for Emily, my 8-year-old niece. She loves dolls, so I thought it would be easy. There I was, wandering through the downtown stores. It all felt like a consumer war. People dashing through aisles with overflowing carts, cashiers swamped with impatient customers. That's when I stumbled across a shop I'd never noticed before. Antique collectibles and memorabilia. The sign looked worn, with some letters flickering intermittently. The window display had a vintage feel, filled with porcelain dolls, toy trains, and wooden toys. It felt out of place amidst all the chaotic modernity. Something drew me inside. As I pushed the glass door open, a bell above jingled. The sound echoed through the space, making it feel larger inside than it had appeared from the outside. The store was empty except for an old man, hunched over behind a worn wooden counter. "Welcome," he said without even looking up. The shelves were tall and crammed, forming narrow, almost claustrophobic aisles. Porcelain dolls stared at me with glassy eyes, and no matter how hard I tried to ignore it, I felt like they were watching me as I walked past. That's when I saw it. It was on a shelf almost hidden at the back of the store, in a dimly lit corner. Unlike the other dolls, which were impeccably dressed, this one seemed forgotten. Its blue dress was faded and torn in places, and its curly blonde hair was tangled. But there was something about its eyes, large and glassy, so realistic they almost seemed alive. I bent down to pick it up. The doll was surprisingly heavy, and its expression seemed to shift slightly depending on how the light hit it. I can't explain why, but I was fascinated. Interested in her? The old man's voice made me jump. He was standing right behind me, though I hadn't heard his footsteps. The man was thin, with deep-set eyes that seemed to look right through me. "Yes, she's different," I replied, trying to sound casual. He chuckled dryly. "Different indeed. I'll be honest with you, son. No one's ever wanted that doll. She's been here for years. I'll make you an offer." He quoted a price so ridiculously low it felt like a joke. "Really? You don't even want to haggle?" I asked, suspicious. "Consider it a Black Friday gift," he said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. I hesitated but ended up agreeing. He wrapped the doll in stained tissue paper, but before handing it over, he held my hand for a moment. "One last thing, son. Never." He paused for a long time, staring directly at me. "Never leave her alone with your niece at night." I didn't understand, but I nodded anyway. He let go of my hand, gave a smile that looked more like a nervous twitch, and hurried me toward the door. As I stepped outside, a cold wind swept through the store. The lights flickered, and the bell above the door seemed to ring on its own. I glanced back, but the old man had already disappeared. Clutching the package tightly, I shook my head, trying to dismiss the strange feeling. It's just a doll, I thought. But deep down, something told me I had just made a terrible mistake. When I got home, I placed the package with the doll on the kitchen table. The apartment was quiet, except for the soft hum of the refrigerator. I lived alone, and most of the time that silence was a relief after a hectic day. But that night, the quiet felt heavier, like something was lurking. I carefully unwrapped the package, revealing the doll once again. Her glassy eyes glimmered under the fluorescent kitchen light. I grabbed a gift box and started packing her up, but I couldn't stop looking at her. There was something unsettling about her face. She wasn't ugly, far from it. Her expression was almost neutral, but her eyes, my brain kept insisting they were watching me, that some spark of life was hiding in them. "It's just an old doll," I told myself. Even so, a cold shiver ran down my spine when I turned away. I had to fight the urge to look at her again. After wrapping her up, I decided to take a hot shower and relax. As the water ran down my face, the muffled sound of the faucet mixed with other noises. Noises that shouldn't have been there. Tap, tap, tap. I froze and turned off the water, holding my breath. The sound stopped. Maybe it was just the wooden floor creaking. Or maybe the wind. Yeah, it had to be that. After getting dressed, I went back to the kitchen. The doll's package looked untouched, exactly where I had left it. I took a deep breath and laughed at myself for being so paranoid. I placed the box in the corner of the living room, turned off the lights, and went to bed. But even under the covers, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I was almost asleep when I heard it again. Tap, tap, tap. This time, it sounded closer, like someone was walking barefoot in the living room. I sat up slowly, straining to hear. The house was dark, lit only by the faint glow coming through the window blinds. Probably the neighbors, I thought. But my building was old, with thick walls, and I rarely heard anything from outside. I stepped out of the bedroom, barefoot, the cold floor grounding me in reality. The living room was empty, the doll's box still in the corner. I sighed and shook my head. Back in my bedroom, I closed the door and climbed back into bed. It's just your imagination, I repeated to myself. But at 3 in the morning, something woke me up. The feeling was almost tangible, as if someone were in the room with me. My throat was dry, and my heart raced even before I opened my eyes. I looked toward the corner of the room and saw it. The doll was there, out of the box. She was sitting on the chair, her face turned directly toward me. For a moment, I was frozen, trying to comprehend how it was possible. I had wrapped the doll. I was sure of it. I got up slowly, as if any sudden movement might draw her attention. I picked up the empty wrapping paper lying on the living room floor, torn as if it had been carefully opened. When I turned back to the doll, I swear her expression had changed. Her porcelain lips seemed to curve into a subtle smile, and her eyes glimmered with a reflection that I knew didn't come from any light. For a moment, I thought I heard something. It wasn't exactly a voice, but a low, barely perceptible sound, like a whisper. I left the room, locking the door behind me. Back in my bedroom, I convinced myself that it had all been a nightmare. The next morning, I thought it was confirmed. The doll was exactly where I had left her. So it really was just a dream, I said aloud. Sunday evening came, and the usual family dinner at Rebecca's house was loud and full of laughter. My nephews were running around the living room while my brother-in-law, Mike, struggled to light the grill outside. My sister looked exhausted but still managed to give me a curious glance as I walked in with the gift in my hands. "Is that for Emily?" she asked, smiling as she wiped her hands on her apron. "Yeah, I hope she likes it." I forced a smile, though my stomach churned uneasily. Emily was the first to notice the package. As soon as she saw me, she ran over, her brown hair bouncing like a bronze bell. "Uncle Ethan, is that for me?" "Of course, but you have to open it carefully, okay?" She grabbed the package and darted to the couch, tearing the wrapping paper with excitement. When the doll finally appeared, the gleam in her eyes made me hesitate. It wasn't the innocent joy I'd expected, but something deeper, almost hypnotic. "She's beautiful," Emily murmured, running her fingers through the doll's hair. Rebecca came up beside me, raising an eyebrow. "Interesting taste, Ethan. Where'd you find that?" "Oh, at a shop downtown. Thought she'd like it. It's a porcelain doll, pretty old." "It's definitely old." Rebecca gave a half smile, though she clearly didn't approve. Emily didn't seem to care about the conversation. She hugged the doll tightly and said, "Her name is Clarabelle." "Emily, did you just come up with that name?" I asked, amused. She shook her head, her gaze fixed on the doll's face. "No," she told me. The room fell silent for a moment, but Rebecca just chuckled and returned to the kitchen. I tried to brush it off too, but a chill ran down my spine. After dinner, I started noticing that Emily was acting differently. Normally, she'd be running around, dragging her cousins into games, but now she was withdrawn. She sat on the floor of her room, cradling Clarabelle in her lap and whispering something no one else could hear. Rebecca walked into the room and called out, "Emily, don't you want to play with the other kids?" "I'm playing with Clarabelle." "Sweetheart, playing with dolls is fun, but what about your cousins?" Clarabelle said she doesn't like anyone here. Rebecca frowned and left, pulling me into the hallway. "That doll is a little strange, don't you think? Kids have wild imaginations." "It's nothing to worry about," I said, trying to sound casual, though Emily's behavior was bothering me. Rebecca gave me a hesitant look but decided to drop the subject for the time being. Later that night, as we were getting ready to leave, a piercing scream echoed through the house. We all rushed to Emily's room and found her huddled in a corner, crying and shaking. "She wants me to hurt you," she screamed, pointing at Clarabelle, who was sitting in the middle of the bed. Rebecca rushed to hold her while Mike glared at me with fury. "Ethan, what the hell did you bring into my house? What kind of gift is this?" "I didn't know. It's just a doll." "Just a doll? Look at it." Mike grabbed Clarabelle and threw her at me like she was something filthy. "Take it out of here now." Rebecca held Emily, who sobbed into her mother's chest. I tried to say something, but there was nothing to explain. I grabbed the doll and left before the situation got worse. When I got back to my apartment, I tossed Clarabelle onto the couch and locked the door. My breathing was ragged, and the silence felt heavier than usual. I glanced at the doll. She was lying on her side, but her glassy eyes seemed to shimmer in the faint light of the lamp. I tried to convince myself that it was all an overreaction. But then, for just a moment, I felt the air around me change, colder, heavier. I sighed and went to my bedroom, leaving the light on in the living room. Not because I was superstitious, but I wasn't willing to take any chances. The first thing I did the next morning was grab the doll and shove her into the hall closet. I slammed the door shut and locked it, as if that would be enough to rid me of the growing unease since I'd brought her home. "It's just a doll," I kept telling myself, but deep down, I knew something was wrong. That night, as I lay in bed, I noticed the digital clock beside me read 3:33. I blinked a few times, confused, because I was sure it wasn't that late. When I checked my phone to confirm, it also read 3:33. Shrugging it off as a strange coincidence, I turned over in bed, and that's when I heard it. A low sound coming from the hallway. It was like someone scratching at the closet door. My throat went dry, and my heart pounded. It's just the wood creaking, I thought, but I stayed frozen, straining to hear. The sound stopped after a few seconds, but sleep didn't return. In the days that followed, things only got worse. It started with small incidents. The TV remote disappearing, only to be found in improbable places like inside the fridge. My keys, which I always left on the entryway table, ended up under the couch. At first, it didn't seem supernatural, just signs that maybe I was more distracted than usual. But then the scribbles started. One night, as I was brushing my teeth, I noticed the first message. It was small, scrawled on the white paint of the hallway wall, almost imperceptible. "Let me out." I froze, rubbing my eyes, thinking it was some kind of smudge. I grabbed a cloth and tried to wipe it off, but the words wouldn't fade. They seemed embedded into the wall, beneath the paint. Later that night, while making a sandwich in the kitchen, I caught something in the corner of my eye. Another message. This time, it was clearer, written in thin, trembling letters on the living room mirror. "You brought me here." I dropped the plate, and the sound of it shattering echoed through the empty room. Grabbing a marker, I firmly pressed it against the mirror, trying to erase the words, but it was useless. They disappeared on their own the moment I looked away and then back at the glass. I needed to understand what was happening. I grabbed my laptop and started searching for information about the doll. First, I looked up antique porcelain dolls, but most of the results were ads or collector websites. Then I typed Clarabelle Curse doll into the search bar. A few pages came up, but none of them would fully load. One flashed briefly, showing a picture that looked eerily familiar. A porcelain doll very similar to mine, but with darker, emptier eyes. Before I could read the accompanying text, the page flickered and vanished, leaving only a white screen with the words, "Error, not found." I kept trying, clicking on shady links and obscure forums. The pattern was always the same. Pages refused to load, or they displayed garbled text, as if written by someone in distress. One phrase stuck with me: "Don't look into her eyes for too long. She will see you back." At that moment, my laptop shut off on its own, despite being plugged in. The light in the room seemed dimmer, as if something was draining the energy. I sat there, staring at the blank screen, and then I heard it again. The same sound as before, coming from the hallway. Scratching, persistent like nails against wood. I stood up slowly, every muscle in my body tense. I walked toward the closet door, fighting the overwhelming urge to run. With each step, the sound grew louder, more frantic. When I placed my hand on the doorknob, the scratching stopped. I stood there for several seconds, my breathing heavy, trying to decide what to do. But before I could turn the handle, I heard something else. A low, muffled laugh, coming from inside the closet. I stumbled back instinctively, tripping over the rug and landing on the floor. The silence returned, but I knew I wasn't alone. The doll was in there, and I was certain she knew exactly where I was. I couldn't ignore it anymore. That morning, I made a decision. I had to return to the store where I'd bought the doll. Maybe there was a logical explanation for all of this. Maybe the shopkeeper could tell me something that would ease the growing fear I felt. The fear that I was losing my grip on reality. I drove to the city center with the doll in the back seat, wrapped in a towel as if that could somehow contain her presence. Traffic felt endless, and every red light stretched on for eternity. When I finally turned the corner where the shop was located, a chill ran down my spine. The building was still there, but something was wrong. The windows were covered in dust and boarded up, and the sign that once read, "Antique Collectibles and Memorabilia," was faded and unreadable. I parked the car and got out, ignoring the biting cold wind. The glass door was secured with a rusty chain, and the interior looked like no one had entered in decades. I tried peering through the cracks in the wooden boards, but the darkness inside was impenetrable. I knocked on the door, knowing it was futile. "Is anyone here?" I shouted, my voice echoing down the empty street. No answer. I began circling the building, looking for an entrance or some sign that I was mistaken. How could a store I'd visited less than a week ago now look like it had been abandoned for years? It made no sense. Returning to the front of the shop, I noticed a small scrap of paper stuck to the corner of a broken window pane. The paper was yellowed and nearly illegible, but I could still make out a name and an address. J.W. Hanover Municipal Library. Without hesitation, I got back in the car and drove to the library. It was an old building with dark brick walls and windows that seemed to belong to another century. As I entered, the smell of aged paper filled my senses, and an elderly woman greeted me from behind the reception desk with a tired smile. "May I help you?" she asked, adjusting her glasses at the tip of her nose. "I'm looking for information about an old toy store downtown. It was called Antique Collectibles and Memorabilia." Her smile faded. "That store closed a long time ago, young man. Why are you asking about it?" I quickly explained that I'd visited the store recently and bought a porcelain doll there. When I mentioned the doll, she looked uneasy, glancing nervously at the empty aisles. "Wait here." She disappeared among the shelves and returned a few minutes later with a thin, dusty file. The owner's name was John William Hanover. He was known for collecting peculiar items, but according to the records, he died in 1987. The shop was never reopened. My stomach dropped. Dead? But I was there just a few days ago. She stared at me, her discomfort deepening. The circumstances of his death were strange, to say the least. Officially, it was ruled a heart attack, but his body was found in the middle of the store, surrounded by toys. Dolls, cars, trains, and, according to the sole witness, something else. A porcelain doll that no one could describe properly. A doll? The witness was a young woman who claimed to have heard voices coming from the shop that night. She never spoke much about it, but left a statement saying, "The cursed doll. It's her fault." My hands gripped the table tightly. What happened to the doll? It vanished, just like the young woman. Her words hit me like a punch. The librarian leaned in, her expression grave. "If you're dealing with something you think came from that store, I suggest you get rid of it as quickly as possible. These stories," she hesitated, as if speaking them aloud was dangerous, "never end well." I thanked her, though her words only deepened my despair. When I returned to the car, I found the doll sitting in the passenger seat. The towel I'd wrapped her in was on the floor. Her glass eyes were fixed on me, and for the first time, I felt certain she was smiling. That night, as soon as I got home, a heavy atmosphere settled over the room. It wasn't just exhaustion. It was as if something unseen was waiting for me, filling the dark corners of the house with its presence. I placed the doll back in the closet, this time wrapping her in multiple layers of plastic and weighing the door down with a heavy box. The sound of the closet door closing echoed strangely through the apartment, as if the space inside was far deeper than it should have been. After a long shower, I sat on the couch, trying to distract myself by watching something on TV, but nothing worked. The voices started as faint noises, blending with the low sound of the show I was pretending to watch. "Ethan," I froze. The sound was faint, almost imperceptible, but clear enough to make me drop the remote to the floor. I looked around the room, but there was nothing, just shadows and the glow of the screen. "Ethan," this time it came from behind me, near the hallway leading to the closet. My chest felt tight, and my breathing grew shallow. Was I hearing things? Was my mind playing tricks on me because of the stress? I decided to ignore it. I turned off the TV, went to the bedroom, and locked the door. That's when the dreams began. The first night, I dreamed I was trapped in a place that looked like my living room, but the walls were crooked, and the windows led nowhere. A feminine figure stood in the darkest corner, her face covered by a disfigured mass of gray flesh, with no eyes or nose, but a grotesque mouth that stretched into a wide, unnatural grin. She was holding something. It was Clarabelle. I woke up with a muffled scream, my body drenched in sweat and trembling. The sensation that something else was still in the room was so strong that it took me minutes to gather the courage to turn on the light. But everything around me seemed normal, or almost everything. On the floor beside my bed was a torn piece of plastic. The next day, I returned to the closet to check on the doll. I placed my hand on the doorknob hesitantly, feeling an inexplicable chill radiating from the wood. When I opened it, my heart sank. The doll wasn't there. I tore apart the entire closet, throwing out boxes and clothes, but Clarabelle was gone. The layers of plastic were piled in shredded strips, and the heavy box I had placed on top of her was still intact, as if it had never been moved. A pang of panic turned into something deeper. It wasn't just fear. It was a growing certainty that I had completely lost control of the situation. When I turned around, I froze mid-step. Clarabelle was there, sitting in the middle of the living room rug. Her small porcelain hands rested on the fabric. Her head was tilted slightly to one side, and her eyes gleamed with a reflection that seemed to come from within her. I swallowed hard, fighting the urge to run, but my feet wouldn't move. The clock on the wall read 3:33. A low sound, almost like a groan, echoed through the empty room. It was impossible to tell where it came from, but it seemed to fill every corner, as if the walls were breathing alongside me. She kept staring at me. It wasn't my imagination. Clarabelle was alive somehow, and every second I stood there only confirmed what I already knew. She had no intention of letting me go. After what happened in the living room, I knew I couldn't simply ignore what was happening. Something deeply sinister was tied to that doll, and I needed to figure out what it was before things got worse. I spent hours on my laptop, delving into obscure forums and sites about antique toys. The texts were filled with theories about curses and haunted objects, but few seemed credible. Until, buried in a forgotten corner of the internet, I found something. It was a thread on an abandoned collector's forum titled, "The Legacy of Elias Grimsby." My heart raced as I read the name. The post was short and direct. Grimsby was a toymaker in the 1920s. His creations were so detailed that people said they had souls of their own. After a series of tragedies involving his dolls, he disappeared. Rumor has it his diary was found and reveals disturbing secrets about his creations. The thread included a link to a scanned version of the diary. I clicked without hesitation. The page took forever to load, and my trembling hands betrayed my anxiety. When it finally opened, the text was written in an old, uneven script. Reading it made my skin crawl. Clarabelle was the last. "I will never make another." That was the first line. The diary described how Elias Grimsby began his career as a toymaker, crafting porcelain dolls so detailed they captured the attention of the wealthy and noble. He was obsessive in his work, always chasing perfection. But something changed when he started working on Clarabelle. I created her with fragments of things that should never have been touched. I don't know if it was greed or destiny that led me to this, but I know she is unlike any other. Elias wrote about hearing voices in the workshop and whispers in the wood. He believed Clarabelle was alive even before she was completed. The eyes. It's in the eyes that she keeps everything. They see more than they should. They see you. The diary entries became increasingly disjointed and disturbing. Elias described how customers who bought his earlier dolls began suffering accidents or disappearing. The dolls always seemed to return to the workshop through means no one could explain. Clarabelle was made with pieces of evil. Not intentionally, but because I couldn't resist. She controlled me, and now she controls anyone who crosses her path. The final entry was barely legible. "If you're reading this, please burn her, bury her, do anything, but don't let her see you for too long." Couldn't. And now she is here with me. I slammed the laptop shut, my mind spinning. It felt like every piece of the puzzle was falling into place, but the picture they formed was too horrifying to accept. I looked toward the living room. Clarabelle was still there, sitting exactly where I had left her. Her glass eyes seemed fixed on me, even from a distance. My heart raced as I noticed something new. Small marks began appearing around her, like cracks on the floor radiating out from where she sat. I stood slowly and crept closer. When I was near enough, I realized they weren't cracks at all but symbols etched into the wood, as if carved from the inside out. Clarabelle seemed to smile. Grimsby's words echoed in my mind, carried by the lines of his diary. "Don't let her see you for too long." I was trying to decide what to do with Clarabelle when the intercom buzzed. I glanced at the screen, startled to see Rebecca and Emily. They never dropped by unannounced, and after their last visit, I thought Rebecca wanted to keep me as far away from my niece as possible. I opened the door, and before I could say anything, Emily darted past me as if she knew exactly where she was going. "Hello to you too," I murmured, glancing at Rebecca, who looked visibly exhausted. "Don't ask." She insisted on coming. She hasn't been sleeping well for days, and for some reason, she said she needed to see you. Rebecca sighed, looking around the house with a frown, as though something felt off. "She hasn't stopped talking about the doll." "Rebecca, don't start, Ethan. Just see if you can distract her while I get some coffee." Before I could protest, Emily was already in the hallway, standing right in front of the closet where Clarabelle was stored. "Emily, don't touch that." I rushed over and grabbed her small shoulders. She looked up at me, and what I saw froze me to the core. Her eyes lacked their usual childlike sparkle. They were dull and vacant. "I missed her, Uncle Ethan," she said in a monotone voice. "Emily, it's just a doll. It's nothing you need to worry about. You don't understand. She needs me. I tried to pull her away from the closet, but Rebecca entered the room at that moment, holding a coffee mug. What's going on here? Nothing, I began, but Emily interrupted. Clarabelle is calling. Rebecca shot me a sharp look. Ethan, why the hell do you still have that thing? I thought you got rid of it. I'm trying. It's just not as simple as it seems. Rebecca huffed, clearly irritated. But before she could say anything else, Emily began murmuring something incomprehensible. It was a language I had never heard before, filled with guttural sounds and nonsensical words. She was staring at the closet door, her lips moving rapidly, and her skin started to turn pale. Emily? Sweetheart, are you okay? Rebecca rushed to her, dropping the mug to the floor with a dull thud. Emily dropped to her knees, clutching her arm tightly. As Rebecca scooped her up, I saw red marks slowly forming on her skin, scratches that seemed to appear out of nowhere. What is this? What did you do to her? Rebecca shouted, holding Emily close. I didn't do anything. Rebecca, listen, this isn't normal. Normal? You think it's normal to have a creepy doll that's doing this to my daughter? It's not just the doll. There's something wrong happening here. She glared at me with a mixture of anger and fear. I don't want to hear it. Just stay away from my daughter. Rebecca gave me one final warning glance before storming out the door, carrying Emily, who was now softly muttering something unintelligible against her mother's shoulder. I stood frozen in the middle of the room, trying to process what had just happened. Then I felt the air shift. The room seemed heavier, darker. I slowly turned to face the closet. Even with the door locked, I knew Clarabelle was smiling. She was spreading her influence, and now it wasn't just me. She had found someone more vulnerable to play with. That same night, I woke up with a sharp pain in my back. When I moved, the sheets scraped against my skin, sending waves of stinging discomfort through me. I got up slowly, reaching back to feel my skin, and touched raised marks. In the bathroom mirror, I saw what seemed impossible. 3 long, parallel scratches running down my back like fresh scars. There was no blood, but the redness was undeniable. I splashed water on my face, trying to shake off the growing panic. This didn't make sense. I slept alone, and even if I'd scratched myself somehow, how could I leave such precise, deep marks? When I returned to the bedroom, I found something that chilled me to the bone. Scattered across the floor were old black and white photographs, most yellowed with age. I picked one up, and my hands started trembling. Clarabelle was there. In the photo, she was sitting on a wooden chair, surrounded by a group of children wearing clothes from what looked like the 1920s. Their faces were blurred, as though time or something else had erased their features. I picked up another photo. This one showed the doll in a dark room, placed in the center of a table surrounded by extinguished candles. It looked like a scene from some ancient ritual. There were dozens of photos, and Clarabelle was in every one of them, sometimes prominently featured, sometimes lurking in the background, but always present. I had never seen these photos before. They weren't mine. When I flipped over the last photo, I found something handwritten on the back. You can't run from her. The room around me seemed to darken, as though the shadows were closing in. I ran to the living room, determined to end this. I grabbed Clarabelle, who was sitting on the couch as if she had never moved, and headed to the balcony. I built a small pile of paper and wood in the corner and threw the doll on top. Striking a match, I watched the flame flicker before tossing it onto the pile. The fire started quickly, roaring and fierce, but Clarabelle seemed untouched. Her porcelain surface reflected the flames, mocking me. The fire suddenly died down, as if smothered by something unseen. The room fell into absolute silence, broken only by a sound that froze me to my core. Clarabelle was laughing. It was a low, rhythmic sound that vibrated in my chest. It didn't come from her immobile mouth, but from somewhere deep within her, echoing from a far-off, unreachable place. My heart raced as I took a step back, feeling an oppressive presence in the air, watching me. Clarabelle wasn't just an object. She was alive, and worse, she was enjoying this. Desperation led me to places I never imagined going. After that night, the scratches on my back, Clarabelle's laughter reverberating through my home, I realized I couldn't handle this alone. I spent the day researching everything I could about the occult, black magic, anything that might help me. That's how I found Darius. He was a middle-aged man with a scruffy beard and weary but piercing eyes. The kind of person you avoid at a bar because the conversation is bound to go places you'd rather not explore. He had a reputation as an expert in cursed objects, someone who knew far too much about the supernatural. When I entered his small office, the smell of burning herbs and aged wood almost made me turn around and leave. "Did you bring something with you?" he asked without looking at me, arranging candles on an improvised altar. "Yes, the doll." He turned his face slowly, as if he could feel the weight of my words. "Show me." I pulled out the bag where I had placed Clarabelle and, with hesitation, set it on the table. He didn't touch the doll. He just stared at her, his face growing paler by the second. "This isn't just a curse. You've brought something much more dangerous." "What do you mean?" Darius took a deep breath, and for the first time he looked genuinely nervous. "This doll is tied to an entity, something that doesn't belong in this world. It's not just cursed. It's a conduit, a bridge." I swallowed hard, trying to process his words. "Is there a way to destroy it?" He was silent for a long moment before finally responding. "There's a ritual, but it has to be performed in the same place where the connection was made." "The shop?" "Yes." Darius grabbed an old grimoire and began flipping through its yellowed pages, stopping at a section filled with symbols. He explained the ritual calmly, but each word felt like a weight pressing down on my chest. "You'll need to draw a circle around her with consecrated salt and burn specific herbs to purify the space. During the ritual, you must recite this invocation." He pointed to a phrase written in a language that looked impossible to pronounce. "But there's a condition." "What condition?" He looked at me, his eyes now filled with something close to pity. "To sever the connection, the entity will demand a sacrifice." My heart raced. "What kind of sacrifice?" "Something that matters to you. It could be a memory, a cherished object, or something deeper." His words echoed in my mind as I looked at Clarabelle, who seemed even darker under the flickering candlelight. "And if I don't do it?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "She won't stop. She'll consume you. And when she's done, she'll find someone else." I closed my eyes, feeling the weight of the choice before me. I had no other option. I left Darius's office with a bag full of herbs, a jar of consecrated salt, and detailed instructions for the ritual. My next stop was the shop, a place that now seemed as cursed as the doll itself. As I got into the car, I felt a presence in the back seat. I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw Clarabelle's eyes gleaming in the streetlight. She knew what I was planning, and she wasn't happy about it. The shop looked even more sinister at night. Its abandoned facade, with dusty windows and poorly nailed boards, seemed to radiate a darkness that swallowed the light from the street. I parked the car and sat there for a long moment, staring at the building. The silence was almost deafening, broken only by the sound of the cold wind whistling through the cracks in the walls. With Clarabelle in one hand and the bag of ritual items in the other, I stepped inside. The interior was as cold as I remembered, but now it felt even emptier, as though the space had impossibly expanded. The shelves were covered in dust, and the toys that once occupied every corner were gone. I walked to the center of the shop, where the wooden floor creaked under my steps. That's when it started. The lights, though switched off, flickered as if some kind of energy was coursing through the space. A cold breeze circled me, carrying the scent of decay and something sickly sweet. I began preparing the ritual. I spread the salt in a circle around Clarabelle and lit the herbs, which released a thick, acrid smoke. My heart pounded as I murmured the words Darius had taught me, stumbling over the pronunciation but pressing on. The voices began as whispers. Ethan, Ethan, do you think you can escape? I ignored them. I focused on the circle, on the words, on the instructions. But the whispers turned into screams. You brought me here. Now you'll pay. The shop seemed to twist around me. The walls bent and stretched as if made of flesh, and shadows crept across the floor, climbing the shelves and closing in on me. That's when I saw her, the figure from my nightmares, the woman with the distorted face, emerged from the darkness. Her skeletal hands, with elongated fingers, nearly dragged along the floor. She moved in jerky spasms, as though every step defied nature itself. Did you think you could run from me, Ethan? Her voice was like the sound of glass shattering, each word cutting into my mind. She was holding Clarabelle now, as if the doll were a part of her. Her eyes, or what should have been eyes, bore into me with an intensity that made my legs tremble. What do you want? I managed to ask, my voice barely a whisper. A choice. The smoke around me began to clear, and then I saw her. Emily. My niece was there, her eyes wide and her face pale. She looked frozen, unable to move or speak. She's here because of you, the entity said, a grotesque smile forming on her formless face. You brought her into my world. Let her go, I shouted, trying to move forward, but the figure raised one skeletal hand and flung me backward like a discarded toy. You must choose, Ethan, your life or hers. Those words echoed through the shop, blending with the screams and the encroaching darkness. I was surrounded, powerless, facing something far beyond my comprehension. I looked at Emily, her eyes now brimming with tears, and thought of everything that had led me here. Clarabelle wasn't just a doll. She was a portal, a bridge to an ancient evil, something that now fed on everyone around me. But how could I choose? Before I could answer, the woman moved closer, bringing the doll nearer. Decide, Ethan, or I'll decide for you. I knew that any choice would have terrible consequences, and time was running out. The entity's words cut through my mind like blades. Emily stood frozen, her face etched with terror, her expression paralyzed in fear. The monstrous figure, with the doll in her hands, crept forward, each step deliberate, as though every movement carried a death sentence. You must choose now, Ethan. Life for life. My hands trembled, but amidst the chaos, a realization struck me. Darius had said that the doll was a channel, a bridge between worlds. If that's what she wanted, maybe there was a way to sever that connection. I forced myself to stand, every muscle in my body screaming in pain. You won't control me anymore, I said, my voice shaking but filled with resolve. The entity laughed, a horrible sound that made the walls of the shop tremble. You think you can fight me? I'm already inside you, Ethan. I'm everywhere. I ignored her. My mind raced with fragments of information, clues left by Grimsby and Darius. The sacrifice didn't have to be someone else. It could be something of mine, something that connected the entity to this world. That connection was Clarabelle. I looked at Emily. For a fleeting moment, her eyes met mine, and in them, I saw something I hadn't seen in days. Hope. With a cry, I lunged toward the circle of salt and snatched Clarabelle from the deformed figure's hands. The porcelain was cold but pulsed as though something alive was trapped within it. You want a sacrifice? Take me, I screamed, clutching the doll tightly to my chest. The entity's grotesque face twisted into something resembling surprise. No, you don't understand what you're doing. Without hesitation, I broke the salt circle with my foot and held the doll against my chest. An unbearable heat spread through my body, as though something was trying to consume me from the inside out. I began reciting the ritual words again. this time with every fiber of my being focused on a single goal: ending this. The shop around me started to collapse. The walls cracked, the shelves toppled, and the space seemed to implode. The entity screamed, her body writhing and dissolving into shadows that were pulled back into the doll. Pain shot through my head, and images flashed before my eyes. Faces I didn't recognize, places I'd never seen, and finally, an impenetrable darkness. The last thing I heard was the entity's voice, faint but still threatening. "You didn't destroy me. I'll wait for another." And then there was silence.
Emily seems fine now. The nightmares that haunted her have vanished, and the dark shadow she carried has lifted like morning fog. Rebecca says she's back to being the sweet, cheerful girl she's always been, but avoids talking about what happened. Who could blame her? As for Ethan, he wasn't so lucky. He's in a psychiatric ward now, in a small padded room with windows that don't open. The doctors say he's suffering from a severe nervous breakdown, but we know it's more than that. Sometimes he mutters to himself, sitting in a corner and rocking back and forth. "She's still here. She's still here," he whispers, his voice low as if afraid someone might hear. And on some nights, the nurses report something strange. In the silence of the hospital, when all the lights are off, they say they hear a soft laugh coming from Ethan's room. Quiet, rhythmic, like the laugh of a doll.